Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. My name is Andrew Fierman, and I'm the head of Sanctions strategy here at Chainalysis. I'm joined today by Adam Hart, senior investigator here at Chainalysis as well. So what we decided would be a good session for you all is to talk about Tornado Cash and the implications of the designation by OFAC, what it means for the industry, for the community, the regulatory side versus the DeFi community, and really kind of exploring the topic. Adam's going to dive in a little bit after I do a quick intro to Tornado Cash, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. He's going to really dive into the Ronin Bridge hack, what it looks like, and what really happened. And then we'll talk about the implications for the cryptocurrency industry as a result of those sanctions. So let's just get it started with what is Tornado Cash. It is a decentralized, non-custodial smart contract. So when OFAC took the action to sanction Tornado Cash, this is quite different than what we've seen from OFAC in the past, where there's not usually a question over whether something is an entity. In this case, Tornado Cash is just open source code. So essentially, OFAC was sanctioning code. So there was a bit of a question and concern over, obviously, their ability to actually do this. But most importantly, a smart contract-based mixer, the sanctioning was very complex and much different than what we've seen from other actions taken by OFAC with regards to mixing services. So just a few months earlier, before the OFAC designation, Blender.io was sanctioned by OFAC. And the thing is, with that, it was a Bitcoin-based, centralized product, which means that it could be shut down by OFAC. So what we see here up here on the top is Tornado Cash, and on the bottom is Blender. Now, at the very end of the bottom here for Blender, you see that essentially once those sanctions happened, it completely cut off access to that service and it stopped running. The difference, though, with Tornado Cash is that it's going to continue to operate in perpetuity. Now, while we do see a significant decline in overall usage, this is more due to the disincentivization of using it because people don't want to run the risk of potentially violating sanctions in the US and putting themselves at potential risk for civil or criminal liability as a result. So we have seen a significant drop in the usage of Tornado Cash since the sanctioning, but it's not for the stopping or cutting off of Tornado Cash as a service. It's simply just a matter of less users. And of course, with a mixing service, the more users you have in the ecosystem, the more beneficial it is to use. So alternatively, the less people using Tornado Cash, the less effective it is as a mixer. So what actually happened with OFAC? Why did they do this? I think at a wholesale, in August, OFAC decided to sanction Tornado Cash because of the fact that it was being used to facilitate the laundering of over $455 million on behalf of North Korea. At the time they were sanctioned under what's called the Cyber 2 program, which essentially talks about explicitly malicious cyber activity. So essentially saying Tornado Cash was facilitating malicious cyber activity, and that's why they were shut down. But in November, and at the first time in August, OFAC only included the addresses related to the mixing service for the smart contracts, but not the service at whole scale. However, in November, after everyone has been arguing about the validity of this designation by OFAC, they actually came out and delisted them and re-sanctioned Tornado Cash, this time including all of the governance as well, basically saying as a service as a whole, even though it is code, it was created by a DAO, and a DAO in OFAC's eyes is considered an entity, and so that's why they went ahead with this. Additionally, they added a new label on the executive order saying that they were being sanctioned because of their exposure to North Korea, and actually, not just that $455 million was due to cyber activity, but also that it was facilitating the weapons of mass destruction program for North Korea. So really taking it up a notch. personally, this could be in response to the lawsuit that happened. It could be just further clarification, as I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions about OFAC's scoping of actually designating a smart contract. So with that said, I'm going to hand it off to Adam to talk a little bit more about the Ronin hack itself.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. And as we get into this hack here, now that we have a little bit of context for sort of what we're talking about in relation to the sanctioning of Tornado Cash by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which again is a part of the U.S. government, when we talk about the reason for the sanctioning, I think it's useful to understand sort of what investigators in the public sector are thinking about when they go through these decisions, and also sort of what's happening on the blockchain, what is possible to see when investigating this activity. We're going to get a little bit into blockchain analytics, which is fundamentally sort of like what we do here in our day-to-day job at Chainalysis. But I recognize that not many people have sort of done this. Maybe you've looked at transactions using a public block explorer. We'll be showing you some screenshots of how this looks in an analytics tool. But feel free to jump in with questions throughout, and definitely let us know if anything's not making sense. We want to make this sort of as open as possible. But to the topic at hand, one of the sort of incidents that definitely prompted the U.S. government's anger towards Tornado Cash was certainly the hack of the Ronin bridge, which was a major incident for the DeFi community. Again, Ronin was definitely its own niche ecosystem, but essentially someone was able to make off with $600 million of stolen funds of users who had put funds through this bridge, connecting the Ethereum blockchain to the Ronin sort of ecosystem. And this is bad for the industry, obviously, but it was particularly bad in the eyes of the U.S. government because it wasn't just anyone hacking those $600 million. It was effectively the North Korean state. And that's why it was such a cause for concern for the U.S. government. And what the U.S. government saw here was the funds were taken from the Ronin bridge to this address, essentially here. And that address, the address that stole the funds, was sanctioned right away. So very shortly after the hack occurred, that address was sanctioned. Now, putting ourselves in the shoes of the North Korean attackers here, what do you do if your address is sanctioned? Do you care? Well, number one, it's on the blockchain, so no one can sort of stop you from moving the funds, right? You control your private keys. But maybe what you do is you say, great, my address has been sanctioned, address 0x123 has been sanctioned. What am I going to do? I'm going to take the funds and move them to a few other addresses and then proceed to start my laundering process from those other addresses. So that's exactly what the North Koreans did. This is what many illicit actors do. They just bounce their funds around a little bit. So the U.S. government observed some additional addresses receiving funds from the original designated address, and then they said, great. We are going to sanction those addresses. They did. Now, in our product, sort of how we react to sanctions is we just create a sort of entity that says this series of addresses was sanctioned on this date, and you can see that here. So those are the addresses that received funds shortly after the attack. They were then sanctioned themselves, but then this became pretty much a game of whack-a-mole, right? What do you do if you're the North Koreans then? Well, you just move to new addresses, right? So they moved funds to new addresses, and the U.S. government said, well, I see you moving funds to new addresses. Those addresses are sanctioned as well, right? And you can sort of see how this cycle would start to repeat and repeat and repeat. Effectively, these sanctions weren't having the desired effect from the U.S. government perspective. They weren't stopping funds. They weren't really changing behavior, right? The purpose of sanctions, and Andrew can chime in on this one better than I can, is to change behavior. And it wasn't having the desired effect. The funds, at the end of the day, were still being sent from these sanctioned addresses, the various sanctioned addresses. You can see the sort of 3 separate original sanctioning events. They were being split up into lots of other addresses and eventually sent to Tornado Cash as a mixing service to try and mix the funds. So this led to the U.S. government and the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, designating Tornado Cash as a mixer, which, as we've mentioned before, is sort of an unprecedented event. It's not a traditional mixing service. It is just contracts on the blockchain, and that had all sorts of implications that we'll get into in just a little bit here. But I think it's also important to note from an analytics perspective that sanctions is certainly a interesting piece of this case, but is by no means the complete story, especially when it comes to the North Koreans' laundering strategy. Tornado Cash was the start of a much longer laundering process, and thankfully, because a lot of the details of this particular case are public, we can sort of walk you all through that one as well. But it's worth noting that Tornado Cash is a mixer. It played a key role. It was used by all sorts of illicit actors as well, but it was definitely the start. And what we can do is, it turns out, if you're moving $600 million through any mixer, that's kind of hard to hide, right? Not a lot of people use mixers in that sort of volume, and the North Koreans, frankly, weren't trying to be that subtle about it. They were moving a whole lot of money through Tornado Cash in a very short period of time, which is not really how you're supposed to use Tornado Cash or any mixing service. And really, they were just sort of creating some nominal anonymity and moving their funds elsewhere. And then from those other addresses, the pattern was essentially they pulled the funds out of Tornado Cash to new addresses, unsanctioned, with no direct connection back to the sanctioned addresses. And then they took the funds at those Ethereum addresses and moved them over to Bitcoin. So there's lots of bridges to get over to Bitcoin, but they moved the funds from Ethereum, the blockchain, over to Bitcoin. Why did they do so? Well, there are lots of other mixing services on the Bitcoin blockchain as well. So this is part of a larger laundering strategy. This is what many bad actors do as well. The North Koreans have a very professional sort of 24/7 laundering operation. They're very used to this sort of thing. And then on the Bitcoin side, they sent it into another mixer, and from there, they would send from that mixer out to a series of cash out points. Now, the reason this is public is some of those funds, when they sent from the Bitcoin mixer on Bitcoin over to cash out points, and when I say cash out points, I mean exchanges where you can convert Bitcoin into currency that they might use to fund their missile program. They sent it to exchanges, and those exchanges were aware of where these funds came from. So they said, I can still see that these are stolen funds. They're coming from sanctioned activity as well. I'm a regulated business. I'm going to freeze these funds. So that's what the exchanges did with some cases. And we're happy to share publicly that at least $30 million of that was seized. A lot of it is still out there, obviously, and we can't get into the details of sort of where that all is. But again, I think it's worth noting here that the Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned Tornado Cash, which is the start of a mixing process. But this is a much larger sort of mixing ecosystem. And increasingly, a lot of attention is paid to non-mixing service, other ways of trying to obfuscate funds. What is the new strategy that we're seeing? What is a new tactic? Well, if you're the North Koreans, again, let's put ourselves in their shoes for a moment here. If you're the North Koreans, the U.S. government is sanctioning your favorite mixing services that you're using. Your funds are getting seized in your initial laundering route when you send them to cash out points. What do? You change up your strategy. You try something new. You try and hide in obscurity, right? So maybe you take funds and you, instead of bridging them over to Bitcoin, where maybe there's more attention, you try bridging them to some more obscure chains, in this case, the BitTorrent chain, through a series of steps here. And again, apologies if I'm going a little quickly here. We're just a little bit limited on time, but this is sort of the way we often depict DeFi bridging transactions. Here we have activity on the Ethereum blockchain to the BNB chain, then a swap, and then a bridge over to the BitTorrent chain. But again, the bad actor here is trying to hide in an obscure chain. They're trying something new, seeing if it works, and seeing if they're able to cash out the funds. So again, following these stolen funds from sophisticated actors like the North Korean state, it's definitely a cat and mouse game. It's constantly going to be changing laundering strategies. But we see governments trying new tools and seeing what works to try and stop this activity as well. But as we'll get into here in just a moment, those actions, particularly in the form of sanctions, have some pretty serious implications for the ecosystem. However, turns out that hopping between blockchains is not necessarily the best approach to launder your money. As you all probably know, if you've ever bridged currency between, say, the Ethereum chain and BNB chain, and you've done so using a decentralized-ish bridge, the data is all public there, right? You interact with the smart contract, you tell it, I would like to send these tokens to this chain at this address, and that's all out there on the blockchain for everyone to see. Bridges are not really designed, in general, they're not designed as sort of privacy tools, as ways of obfuscating where your money's going. And although there's been some attention from public sector side, from folks commenting on crypto laundering, saying, oh, bridges are a laundering tool, I at least personally would push back on that a little bit and say that most bridges between blockchains are just transparent tools to pass information between those chains. They're not trying to really obfuscate what's going on. And in most cases, you can sort of see what comes in and what goes out due to the inherent transparency of blockchain networks. So that's our very brief summary of the Ronin Bridge hack, the sort of public investigation. Before we get into the implications, any questions or concerns on that? Okay. Well, in that case, I'll pass it back to Andrew to talk about what it all means.
Thanks, Adam. So what we ended up seeing were quite a lot of compliance challenges. And these challenges come in a lot of different forms, depending on where you sit in the ecosystem. As a centralized exchange or cryptocurrency business, if you are subject to US jurisdiction, it's very simple. You simply cannot transact with Tornado Cash after they were sanctioned. As a centralized exchange, it's pretty easy because you have a compliance team in place. You have people who can look at things like direct, indirect exposure, be able to assess the difference, assess where there's actually a legitimate sanctions violation in play versus just some indirect exposure where you might have a service in between that isn't actually a violation. That's a pretty clear-cut case, but I think for the rest of the industry, things get really complicated quickly. With DeFi platforms, obviously having a compliance program is against the whole point of it being decentralized. So how do you conduct proper due diligence? Well, we saw a lot of challenges with this early on. So I'm sure we've all heard of the dusting attacks that occurred shortly after the designation. So essentially, somebody thought it would be fun to send 0.1 ETH direct from Tornado Cash to all of these different very well-known wallets, including those of people like Jimmy Fallon, Snoop Dogg, Steve Aoki, et cetera. And so essentially what now happens is these famous people's wallets are now tainted with Tornado Cash funds. So if they're using a DeFi protocol that is automatically blocking even indirect exposure, now, as that protocol, you're stopping people like Jimmy Fallon from using your platform just because they got sent 0.1 ETH. As we all know, you can't stop yourself from receiving funds. So it puts these people and these DeFi protocols in a really tough place. Additionally, and just kind of hopping back to this last slide, it creates similar problems for other spaces, including the mining and staking pools, Web3 infrastructure, wallet providers, stablecoin issuers, et cetera. I mean, from a mining and staking perspective, do you have to start monitoring the blocks you're mining? I mean, there's no answers for this, just FYI. But these are questions that get raised when we have a really complex situation like this that may have not been fully thought through at the time. Now, fortunately, OFAC has been pretty verbal. While certainly not making everyone happy, they did clarify that they aren't going to take precedent in taking action against any dusted funds. So essentially, if you've been dusted with Tornado Cash funds, fear not, you're probably not going to be in the eyes of OFAC anytime soon. So where managing the exposure gets really complex, it can be pretty easy if you are, like I said, an exchange, but as a DeFi protocol, it gets pretty difficult. So kind of diving back into some of the screenshots Adam was showing before, in the case of Lazarus Group transferring the funds into Tornado Cash, let's go a few days before Tornado Cash was designated. At this point, they were certainly aware that they had been processing the funds related to the Ronin Bridge hack. They had also publicly made it clear that they were trying to resolve this issue, especially given the fact that Blender.io, another mixing service that I mentioned earlier, had been sanctioned just a few months beforehand. So aware of the fact that OFAC might have their eyes on them for facilitating this activity. If you're Tornado Cash before the designation, you come into a pretty quick challenge because as a DeFi protocol or as any decentralized service, if you're monitoring just for direct exposure, you're going to continue processing these funds. As Adam said, it's essentially been whack-a-mole with OFAC, right? So OFAC designated the first address, they moved them to these second addresses, OFAC designated these second addresses, but then they just kept going, and then they moved them into an intermediary wallet, and then immediately into Tornado Cash. This would be an indirect exposure. But clearly, this is the same actor operating, just attempting to obfuscate further, move their funds a little bit more. And we see here, there was a single deposit, meaning that all of the funds that this intermediary wallet received came directly from North Korean hacking group, and then onward, in 87 different withdrawals on its way into Tornado Cash. Yep.
So you followed 88 transactions, right? What if it was like 2,000 transactions?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a little bit more legwork for Adam and his team, for sure. I don't know if you want to.
What stopped them from doing a transaction in like automated way? Like to write a code that opens a wallet and to transfer the money. It could be thousands of wallets of transactions for you guys. Like
Yeah, so great question. And actually, in this case, they definitely did automate, and there was some. If you're very familiar with the way Tornado Cash works, you'll be familiar with relayers. There were sort of relayers that realized this and started sort of stealing money from the Lazarus Group as well. But that's a side note. The short answer is we're not really following these manually one by one. We're sort of comparing how these entities relate to each other. So I can just, in an analytics tool where, this is Reactor, this is our sort of analytics product that we use to track these funds. We have one entity, think of it as this intermediary wallet, and we just see sort of all of its connections to the other entity. That can be one connection, or it can be, 2 million connections. And it's just sort of, we can aggregate that view and see the flow of funds overall.
So essentially what you have here at the end of, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
How you can track the funds after it's put in the chronology? Again, you can have a kind of a relationship between the wallets that put in the chronology, but after when you went out, how you can track the funds?
Yeah, so in general, we don't really comment on sort of our capabilities around mixers, but in general, the idea with mixers is if you want to gain any sort of privacy using a mixer, you need to have other people to mix your funds with, right? And if you're trying to mix $600 million in the span of like a month, there's just no one else who's going to be your counterparty for $600 million, right? So you can sort of see where the funds are going, and this has been sort of publicly done by many different entities, sort of figuring out where the funds ended up after Tornado Cash.
You don't have 100%. You don't know for 100% that these funds are related to how we put it.
I can't really get into it further than that, but effectively, at high volume, you can see what goes in and what comes out.
I think also just to add to that, the typology of how those funds move on their way out is another sign that somebody can be able to track further. So kind of coming back to this example, if you are a DeFi protocol monitoring your compliance or having a compliance setup where you are monitoring only direct exposure, you're going to end up processing all of these funds related to North Korea and maybe find yourself in some hot water like Tornado Cash ended up. However, alternatively, if you do have a centralized service or an opportunity or ability to track compliance, investigations, especially when it comes to the indirect alerts, this makes your process a lot easier because you can look at a few different aspects of it. You can look at a temporal aspect. So if, in this instance, you have Tornado Cash sending funds to this first intermediary wallet in September, but the transactions forward only happened months earlier, you can deduce that the money coming from Tornado Cash to this intermediary wallet happened well after the rest of those transactions happened. And while you may receive alerts for it, you certainly can at the very least say, hey, listen, Tornado Cash sent these funds to these intermediaries well after these funds came to us, so we know that our funds aren't tainted. Additionally, there are other assessments you can do. Indirect exposure is there because we simply cannot know every single entity that's on the blockchain. So while we have these labeled as intermediary wallets, they'll simply just be a few random addresses on the blockchain. But another thing that centralized services can do in their compliance assessments is see what kind of intermediary wallets these are. So in this case specifically, you can see, I think my head was in the way here, but you could see that there's quite a lot of withdrawals and deposits into that wallet. So one could potentially deduce, depending on their own internal policies, that this is a service wallet. And as we don't trace through services, you can make that assessment that, hey, listen, again, similarly, the Tornado Cash funds did hit this other service, but they aren't indirectly hitting us at all, and therefore we're able to, process this alert and confidently be able to say that we aren't dealing with Tornado Cash. So I think there's a lot of different challenges when it comes to how you actually manage compliance function, especially after the sanctioning of open source code, which has never been done before. So yeah, before I hand it back to Adam, I saw a hand in the back there. So yeah, so my understanding there is I believe there were ties to the FSB or believed ties to the FSB, and that was the reason that he was arrested, not specifically because he wrote the code. But don't quote me on that. I'm not positive. Before I hand it back to Adam to talk more about the implications, does anyone have any other questions?
Yeah, so again, for that one, speaking broadly here about not just Tornado Cash, but any mixer, the idea is if you're mixing a massive amount of money, like $600 million, there's no equivalent counterparty transacting in that size, and especially in the case of the North Koreans in the Ronin Bridge hack, there was a very clear pattern of activity. So that's the best I can do there. Sorry. Okay. Awesome. So just, again, to wrap things up here, and feel free to toss questions our way as well, we wanted to talk a little bit more not only from the perspective of a centralized exchange, but also sort of from the perspective of these DeFi platforms. How is the challenge different? What are the meanings of these types of sanctions events? And one key distinction and one thing that we like to think about a lot is if you're a platform, what is technically possible? Sanctions are a tool that were really designed in the world of centralized institutions interacting with one another. So what is possible if you are, say, a platform like Uniswap, right? What do you control versus what don't you control? And in short, it generally comes down to two different layers, right? You have the user interface level, where maybe Uniswap Labs as an entity or any DeFi platform, they have some sort of UI, the official UI that they control, and they manage that code directly. Now that might be somewhat decentralized, but many platforms have UI that they control, and at that level you can implement some sort of screening, right? That's where we actually saw the screening occur by various DeFi platforms in the wake of the Tornado Cash sanctions, right? When we saw as Andrew mentioned, a famous crypto person, Justin Sun, complained very loudly that he was being blocked from using Aave, a lending platform. Was Justin Sun actually blocked from using Aave? Well, he was blocked at the user interface level because the user interface ran a check in the browser, essentially, and said, this address that you're trying to transact from has received funds from Tornado Cash directly. Therefore, we're not letting you use our platform for now. However, if Justin Sun wanted, he could go directly to the smart contracts, assuming that whatever platform he wants to use, or in that case, is actually decentralized and has code that is permissionless, you could go directly to the contracts and execute your transaction because, again, no one can stop that. That's just a transaction on the blockchain. So there is some manner of compliance maybe possible at that user interface level, at that friendly way of interacting with the protocol. But if you're willing to, send your transactions, format your transactions yourself, and send them directly to the appropriate contracts, you can certainly execute your transactions. And frankly, sophisticated actors like the North Koreans, they're not using front ends. They're sending transactions directly to the contracts. They're running their own infrastructure. They're not even going to be using, a normal RPC provider. So, sophisticated actors more than able to sort of skirt those sorts of transactions. But then we also had, we saw all sorts of entities sort of try and do things at the user interface level, including Tornado Cash itself, which Andrew mentioned. But again, that's only at the user interface level. Then we had this other big question emerge, which is censorship something we can do? Is sanctions compliance something we can do at the protocol level, at the block building level? And this became very relevant following the merge on the Ethereum blockchain, where we had the introduction of MEV Boost and sort of various interesting technical arrangements there. But effectively, without getting into the details there, you had a lot of actors building blocks on the Ethereum network that did not include transactions interacting with Tornado Cash. So this arguably is censorship at the protocol level to some extent. And the question is this possible? Is this something that is, if the US government wanted to make everyone block North Korean transactions, is that possible? And the short answer to that is no, right? That's the whole design of a decentralized network like Ethereum. And even at current levels of 73% of blocks being built don't include Tornado Cash transactions by default, or use relays that don't include it. That still means that a transaction interacting with Tornado Cash, a sanctioned transaction to say, it would get included in the network in, I think it would be around 2 minutes. And if the network got up to 99% sort of OFAC compliant blocks, then sanctioned blocks would still be getting in the network every 20 minutes. So, all you need is one block builder who's including, any transactions, and you're still getting those quote unquote, that you're getting some properties of censorship resistance. However, the response from the Ethereum community in particular has been rather strong in reaction to this trend of many validators on the network building OFAC compliant quote unquote blocks. And we've seen really a lot of attention being paid at the sort of protocol level to building solutions to avoid this sort of possibility in the first place, to prevent people from, or to prevent validators from actually implementing this sort of censorship at the protocol level, because again, that's the whole purpose of a decentralized network, is to be censorship resistant. And while certainly institutions, especially institutions interacting with US persons in the US, unless you want to go to jail, you definitely have to enforce sanctions if you are handling customer money. If you're just building blocks, that's an entirely different question. And we've seen all sorts of technical developments. I would highly encourage folks to look into Suave, which is the sort of next, the roadmap from the Flashbots team to sort of explain how the Ethereum network and the sort of MEV ecosystem might evolve to avoid this sort of censorship enforcement. But I think there's a lot of attention being paid to this right now, rightly so, to make sure that sanctions enforcement at the protocol level isn't as technically possible as it is maybe right now. So with that, I'll say we can open it up unless you've got any closing thoughts there. But yeah, thanks so much everyone for the time and attention. And again, please let us know if you have questions. Awesome. Also, before folks head out, I did want to mention, if you're interested in learning more sort of about blockchain analytics writ large, or anything related to this case, definitely feel free to scan this form. We had a very short amount of time here, especially when we're talking about a really complex case. So we've got a few sort of reports and blog posts in there. definitely download those. And then also, if you've got more questions, we've got a booth out there. We're more than happy to talk through any of the theory behind all this, or sort of the more practical stuff of how we actually do the tracing.